So why to do this book? Again, The Rise of Colleges. I did a book review a few months ago, which talked about the Muslim contribution or the Islamic contribution to the English Enlightenment. Sort of for the same reason I thought this book would be of use. Number one, it highlights the Muslim contribution to learning and educational systems and institutions. Secondly, it is very clear in what was the differences between the East and West institutions. And perhaps we can learn from some of the innovations and differences that happened between the two forms of learning, East and West, and learn some examples or lessons for how we conduct ourselves in the future. So understanding our heritage, understanding the limits of what we did, and understanding the contribution towards the Western systems of learning, and also to understand maybe to look deeply and how we can improve our own systems of learning going forward. So basically George Makdisi's his essential thesis is he goes through the institutions of learning in Islam and their evolution over time. And then he goes into the methodology of teaching, how was things taught. Then he goes into the officers or the positions of different teachers or professors and other institutions. He goes into the mechanisms of funding these institutions, particularly the Waqf mechanism. And then after you get a total picture of the Islamic system, then he goes and talks about the Western system and development of the university. And so he looks, and then the idea being that once you've seen the entire picture of how Islamic educational systems developed and their methods for teaching, that you will now at least appreciate what things could have come from Islam and the influence into the Western system, and what may not have been as influential. So, many times, in fact, we did it with the other book, with the Enlightenment book, is that there are contributions that Islam has made which, the people who took the contributions, they didn't acknowledge. And in fact, they dismissed, and in fact, they distorted where it came from. And to the point that people have no conception of the actual contributions, and it leads to a severe distortion in not only the Western mind, but the Muslim mind about what is Islam all about. Because if you look at its true contributions, you can appreciate it even more deeply. So he starts off with what is the first form of institution of learning, and it was the majlis, which was present in the masjid. And the majlis could indicate several things. In fact, majlis as a word, it can indicate, number one, the hall in which teaching hadith took place. This is an example of majlis. He gave the example in Arabic, خرج إلى مجلسه الذي كان يملي فيه الحديث. He says he went to his majlis where he used to dictate hadith. And that was an example of a statement. Also, the lesson itself could be called majlis. لم يحدث إلا مجلسا أو مجلسين. This is another example. He didn't deliver any except for one or two lessons, majlis or majlisain. And it could also indicate the post, the position of the professor. هو المقدم من أصحابه والذي بعده في مجلسه. He was the preeminent of his fellows and the one who succeeded to his chair. And he says that jalasa, what does jalasa mean? Jalasa means to sit up. Qa'ada means to sit down. And he made this difference between the two because Jalasa was somebody who sat up from the prayer and sat up to deliver the lesson. And that's why it was called majlis, because the teacher is sitting up to deliver this lesson. And Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, he says that they give an example of the early Salaf. He said they used to attend Jum'ah, they would pray 2 rak'ahs, then they would sit up to teach the religious science and the sunnah. ثُمَّ جَلَسَهُ يَبُثُّنَّ الْإِلْمَ وَالسُّنَّةِ. So majlis was the position that the teacher assumed after performing the prayer. And later it applied to many other things, places where activities where teaching took place. Majlis al-Nadhr or Majlis al-Ilm is a place for disputation or a place for knowledge. And in this statement about Muwaffiq ad-Din Abdul Aziz al-Sulami, he died in 604 Hijri, he was a physician of Damascus. It says, كَانَ لَهُ مَجْلِسِ عِلْمٍ لِمُشْتَغِلِّنَا عَلَيْهِ بِالطِّبِّ. He had a seminar for those studying medicine under his direction. So again, the word majlis is indicating a seminar or a lecture. There were many different types of majalis. There was majlis al-shu'ara, poets would sit in majlis al-adab, majlis al-fatwa, majlis al-fatwa wal-nadhr, legal opinions and disputations, majlis al-tadris al-fatwa, teaching the Islamic law. But the mosque was the primary institute of learning. And in fact, Khatib says it was preferred. فضل التدريس الفقه في المسجد. It was a preferred place for learning to take place. Now we go to a different terminology, which is jama'. And there were 2 types of mosques or masajid. There was the jama' and the masjid. And Friday khutbah would take place in the jama'. And this jama' was actually something that established by the government. You could not make your own masjid. Let's say you started a masjid, you could not make it into a jama' except by the authority of the ruler. In fact, there was a mosque. This is from one of his accounts that he brings forward. Al-Hashimi built a masjid in the Harbiya quarter with the intention of making it into a jama'. The Khalifa would not allow it, but then the next Khalifa came after him and he asked again, and the Khalifa asked the scholars for their opinion, and they had a favorable opinion, so he allowed it to be made into a jama'. What was the difference? He had to be renovated and a mimbar would be put in. So in other words, in the early days, not every masjid would have Salatul Jum'ah. In fact, only the Jama' Masjid would have Salatul Jum'ah in most of the big cities. For example, the difference was in Cairo, in contrast to Baghdad and Damascus, there were a great number of Friday mosques, which was counter to Islamic legal opinion. So in fact, there was also Islamic legal opinion that you should not have Jum'ah in all these different masajid, rather it should be in one central mosque, or when it became too big, they made many of them. So, many people say we have created an innovation here. We have every mosque, we have 3 Jum'ah shifts as well, not just one. And we have it in every single mosque and every single place where we can hold it. But alhamdulillah, that allows for some facilitation of the deen. But in the past, it was not in that manner until later on it became different. So the Jama' itself had certain halaqas and zawiyas. So the Umayyad Mosque had 8 zawiyas, and the Sulaimaniya Mosque had in Istanbul had 8 madrasas. So the mosque itself had eventually to include larger complexes. They made schools and colleges attached to the masajid. Ibn al-Jawzi, he quoted Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. He said that he attended Friday prayer in 6 different Jama' mosques in Baghdad, and they continued until 451 Hijri, in which year the mosque in the Baratha quarter, it was no longer performed. So another example of the Jama' has to be authorized. So that was a Jama' masjid where he used to perform Jummah until its authority was removed. There were appointments for halaqah posts. Al-Baghdadi also said he asked the Khalifa for permission to dictate hadith in the mosque of Al-Mansur. And because he had a different viewpoint than the Hanbalis that were surrounding that mosque in Mansur area in Baghdad, he had to give him like a security protection. He sent security protection with him, which was Naqib. Naqib was a official who was in charge of the affairs of the Sharif, the descendants of the Prophet ﷺ. He had a special position called Naqib. And the Naqib was sent by the Khalifa so that there would be no fighting when he came. In another instance, Al-Bakri, who was another Ash'ari who was wanting to give a lecture in Al-Mansur, he had to get the military to support him, because when he went there, the Naqib said he couldn't guarantee his safety. So these are just examples of the fact that these kind of halaqas and positions were in fact sometimes authorized by the government. So halaqas were taught according to the subject or by the occupants. So we have halaqat al-baramika, which were special halaqat or lectures just by the Baramika family that had sponsored them. And we had Abu Bakr al-Najjad, he's a hadith expert. He had 2 halaqas in Jam' al-Mansur, one before Jum'ah and one after, one on Hanbali fiqh and another on hadith. In fact, these halaqas were so standardized. Imam al-Shafi'i, when he left his halaqah, he told his disciple Al-Bawaiti, Abu Yaqub, to stand up and take over the halaqah. So it was not by something that was without any order. And the larger halaqas were most commonly hadith lectures. And so the hadith lecturer would sit and dictate hadith to the audience, and these were large audiences, to the point that they had a mustamli, assistant, who would sit in the back and he would repeat the text of the hadith dictated to the people farther away. So these were larger seminars that had these kind of positions. And the Khalifa used to pay the professors, but the students were free to attend whatever halaqah that they chose. And then there came to be these schools called Maktab and Kuttab. And these were the places of elementary education. I still think in Egypt we have Kuttab school. I don't know, in Syria we have Kuttab school as well? Yeah. Used to, yeah. But I think many of if you look at some of the people, historical, political figures in Egypt, many of them studied in Kuttab school, especially learning the Quran early on. That was elementary education. And he gave an example of Al-Farisi. He was speaking about a former classmate. He said, he was my classmate in Maktab, in the study of law. So these were early educational institutions. The Maktab and Kuttab were the early educational institutions. And after that, you would graduate to a higher level of education. Let's see. So we get to, after the majlis, we get to what were the masajid as early colleges of Islam. Abu Ja'far al-Madani, he taught in the Prophet ﷺ's masjid. And sometimes there were masjids named after people, Masjid Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, and Masjid al-Kisai, Masjid al-Shafi'i. And so these masajid became famous, and then they started to have next to them a place of residence, which they would call the Khan. And so they had a complex, a Masjid Khan complex. So you go from just the masjid itself, but why do you need a place to live? Because these institutions, they have people coming from far away, right? And they are staying there for the average educational time for this first undergraduate teaching was 4 years. So 4 years of learning, they would stay in these dormitories, which were called the Khan, and so they had these Masjid Khan complex. The Khan served as a hotel or an inn, a warehouse, a dormitory for out-of-town students who had multiple different purposes. And then you had places of learning that were not what's it called? They were not masajid. They were places where you could learn. Actually, sorry, I'm making a mistake. Yeah, there were places that you could learn foreign sciences. So the majlis and the masjid was a place for learning Islamic sciences, but there was also gradually became extended sciences like medicine, like philosophy, like Greek sciences. And so where would people learn those sciences? They would go to libraries. And so you see all of these terms were used for library. Beit, which means room, khizana, which means closet, dar, which means house, or it would be related to the content like hikmah, wisdom, ilm, or qutb. So like for example, if you combine those two, you'll see Beit al-Hikmah, Dar al-Hikmah, Khizan al-Hikmah. So, they have basically combined these different terms together to make a library. And the most famous was, of course, Beit al-Hikmah, which was founded by the Khalifa al-Ma'mun, who died in 275 Hijri. It was also called Khizanat al-Hikmah, Ali ibn Yahya al-Munajjim. This is a longer term version of this. But he said that he had a palatial residence, a great Khizanat al-Qutb, of which he called it Khizanat al-Hikmah. So people started collecting books, and in these libraries, they started to have debates as well. They started to learn as well in these libraries. And in the library was a place where you didn't necessarily need to teach Islamic sciences. You could teach other sciences as well. And in fact, people used to refer to them in the plural khaza'in, like they were closets, but they were in fact libraries. And these were places you could study without any cost. And people, in this one quote, he says, there is a Dar Qutb like the one in Basra, and both Dars belong to Ibn Sawar. However, the Khizana of Basra is greater and more frequented and had more books. So they used to, every place would have a Khizana or a Beit al-Hikmah or Dar al-Ilm, but some places would have much larger places of books, and some places would have smaller. There was also, we call in Persian was Bimaristan, the first hospitals. In Arabic became Maristan. Maristan became a hospital, but they also started teaching medicine at the hospital. So, that was, and that people could go there and get ijaza in medicine. So they would get certificates that they were certified by the doctor there in medicine. So the basic course of law in the masjid took 4 years. And what was the difference? So we had the masjid, we had the majlis, which was in the masjid. Then we have development of the Masjid Khan complex, right? And then we have the development of the madrasa. So this was the third stage of institutional development. So we're talking about the institutional development of Islamic learning. These were the 3 stages. And what was the difference? The masjid was founded as a waqf. And once a waqf is founded for a masjid, it is freed from the founder's control. This is called waqf tahriri. It becomes free. The founder can no longer control the masjid itself. The madrasa, there was a waqf that the founder it would be under his control and his descendants if he wanted. And so the Masjid Khan complex we find in the 4th century Hijri, the 10th century Gregorian calendar. The madrasas start to come into place in the 5th century Hijri and in the 11th century of the Gregorian calendar. So you can see not only is there a sequence in how these are developing, there's a natural sequence, but there's a time sequence as well. Over time, you build a masjid, you start teaching in the masjid, you need places for your students to stay, you build a place for them to stay. Now it becomes bigger and bigger. Now you make it into a madrasa. And this is what George Maqdisi says is the equivalent of a college. The Islamic colleges were the madrasas. And so that was his direct translation. One of the key persons who's really expanded these in large numbers, Badr, and he has it in English, so I'm going to mess this up, Ibn Hassanawayh, I don't know, Al-Qurdi. He was, his father was a man of great power of influence. He died in 369 Hijri, 979 in the Gregorian era. He was a governor of many provinces. And when he died, the son, Badr, took over his position. And during the course of his 32 years of being governor, he built 3,000 Masjid Khan complexes. This is all over, the Abbasid area, the Muslim area. He built 3,000 of these complexes. He also established pensions, and he would give sadaqah to the scholars, who are poor, and the poor sharifs that were also his responsibility. This is a story of one such student, Abu Ali al-Fariqi. He died 528. He said, I took up residence in a khan facing the masjid of Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi in the quarter of Bab al-Maratib, wherein resided the fellows of the masters and the law students studying under his direction, meaning al-Shirazi. When we were many, there were about 20 of us. When we were few, there were 10. Master Abu Ishaq was teaching us the law course, Ta'alliqah, in a period of 4 years. So when the student was done, it was not necessary for him to study anywhere else. He used to give us a lesson after Salat al-Fajr and another after Salat al-Isha. And in the year 460, I crossed over to the west side of Baghdad to Sayyid Abu Nasr al-Sabah, studying his work, Ash-Shamil, under his direction, and then I returned to Abu Ishaq and became his fellow until he died. So that's just an example of one student, how he studied at that time. And there was different areas in Baghdad. Along with that, there were other institutions that were developed. He called them cognate institutions. There were institutions like Ribat, Khanqa, Zawiya, Turba, Dawaira, Dar al-Hadith, Dar al-Quran. These were other kinds of institutions. Then there came to be madrasas. He calls them double madrasa, triple madrasa, quadruple madrasa, madrasa with a jama mosque attached, madrasa with a Dar al-Hadith, madrasa with a Maristan, with the hospital attached, madrasa medical school, and so on. And these kinds of institutions started developing. So we go from majlis, Masjid Khan complex, madrasa. Now the madrasa itself is expanded into multiple areas. And so this is how the institutions developed. Madrasatul Nizamiya is one of the important institutions. Nizam al-Mulk, who was the wazir for the Seljuks for 30 years, he developed this Madrasa Nizamiya, and we talked about Shirazi in that example from the student. Well, it applies here because Shirazi was the first principal of this school. He was appointed by Nizam al-Mulk for that. And it was originally Shafi'i in its orientation. It was developed by prominent Shafi'i scholars, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, Ibn al-Sabah, Abu Sa'ad al-Mutawalli, and more famously Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. He also was a teacher and a professor there. And when Al-Ghazali left this school in 1096 of the Gregorian calendar, it had 3,000 students. So you can see the size of these institutions. When we had the original one, 20 students were staying in there. Now there are 3,000 students staying in these colleges. So again, they had progressed. They got a more sustainable funding source, a larger student body, and the curriculum was more regular and predictable, and underpaid lecturers. So how were these institutions sustained? And that was one of the innovations of Islam, which was the waqf. And the waqf, once the waqf was established, it was, that establishment was sacrosanct. And this is, he says, this is a maxim in law, nusus al-waqif ka nusus al-shara'. The principle, the provisions of the founder who establishes the waqf is as binding as the provisions of the lawgiver, meaning Allah. Meaning this is, you cannot change the provisions of the waqf. And there are some exemptions to this. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he said that if the waqf was established for like a haram purpose, for example, then obviously, it can be cancelled. And for other reasons, there are some reasons if the waqf was established inaccurately, without any funding mechanism, for example, then it can be concluded. But basically, the waqf was established in this way, and it was, once it's established, it's established. You cannot change the rules. And if you forgot to do something, then you forgot to do it, you cannot change it. For example, if somebody forgot to appoint a mutawalli or a trustee for the waqf, well, now it's too late. You already established the trust. And now who is the one who will establish the mutawalli? It will be the qadi, the judge of that area will have to establish a trustee. Once it's established, the founder of the waqf, this is a Islamic stipulation, could not benefit from the waqf himself. You establish the waqf, you cannot benefit from it. So they gave an example of a waqf where a person, this is Islamic law example, he founded a waqf and he specified that the produce from the farm or whatever that was part of the waqf, they would give a certain amount to the students, and everything above that would return back to him. And they debated whether this was allowable or not, and they said ultimately, whatever amount comes back to him has to be what is customary for a trustee. Meaning whatever a trustee would normally be paid, that's the amount he can get, and no more than that. So in fact, even the person establishing the trust, he can make illegal stipulations that have to be canceled. So these are not allowed. There was interesting exception, which is the Maliki madhab. The Maliki madhab prohibited the founder from being the mutawalli. So it is maybe one of the reasons, this is what Maqdisi says, that the Malikis didn't have very many awqaf in their areas, because the founder could not be the trustee. And it is one of the reasons, he says, that in the areas where Maliki madhab was more predominant, the state had to establish institutions more than private people. This comes into play a bit later when we talk about the western side next to the Maliki areas. So the waqf, these were some of the officials of the waqf. The mutawalli is the trustee. There's he writes it in English, so I don't know if it's Nadir or Nadir. There's Qayyim, Mushrif, Mubashir. These are all different positions that the waqf had. So if you had a large waqf, you would have maybe you would even have 2 different trustees. Maybe you would have multiple of these positions. And each one of them had different duties. For example, some of them were involved, Jabir was somebody who collected revenue from the tenants. Sayrafi was the one who examined the money and weighed it. These are actual coins, so they're weighing the coins. And others would lease the property, oversee the planting, collecting income from the waqf estate. So these were all different things that the waqf would do. So Again, we talked about the three levels of the institutions, how they developed, and the funding mechanism, which was the waqf. And now, as far as the division of fields of knowledge, basically there were three sets of knowledge fields that the Islamic institutions were either teaching or taught in separate institutions, but in collaboration. Islamic sciences, philosophy and natural sciences, and literary arts. And the relative importance was dependent on the era. And grammar was a key need for the other sources. So, one of the necessities of grammar and poetry was given in this Ghulam ibn Shunbuth. He said that I know 50,000 verses of poetry. And he said, why? As documentary proof for the meaning of the words of the Quran. So in other words, poetry was necessary because how would you know what the words of the Quran meant without some of this knowledge? So that's one of the reasons why they taught poetry. Foreign sciences, as we mentioned, were initially excluded, but later did become part of the curriculum. So this was the normal sequence of courses. Quran, Hadith, Quranic sciences like tafsir, sciences of Hadith, like studying the biographies of the different narrators of Hadith or the chain of narration. Usul al-Din, principles of religion. Usul al-Fiqh, madhab, meaning the specific law of your madhab. Khilaf, the divergences of the law. And jadal, which is argumentation or dialectic thinking. And so these were in order, meaning the earlier ones were for lower grade students and the higher ones as you progressed. And to give you an example of how somebody might teach Imam al-Shafi'i, this is one of his examples of how he would spend his day. He would start after Fajr teaching Quran, then he would teach Hadith, then he would engage in mudhakara and nadhr. He would both discussion and disputation. So this would be a time for intellectual back and forth. And then he would teach grammar, poetry, and Arabiya. And then at Dhuhr time, he would leave. That was his lecture schedule. Subhanallah. And to give you an example of a student, Abu Bakr al-Farisi, the one we mentioned before, he attended Maktab when he memorized the Quran. So he went to the Maktab to memorize the Quran, the earlier classes. Then he learned Hadith from his uncles, and then he learned literary sciences from his father, who had been previously a professor. And then he studied under another person, Ali ibn Fadl al-Maghribi, whose work he had copied. And then he received a certificate of Sama'. He heard, the teacher heard him recite the works under him. So that's what the certificate was for. He studied Usul al-Din and Tafsir with his uncles, and then he went on to study law. This is an example of a student of that time. And in fact, in the class, they had different positions. The greater one's knowledge, the closer you sat to the professor. And the farther you were, the more distance, lower level students sat far away. So fellows sat right next to the professor. Let's see. I think, let me move on from that to just talk about the length of studies. The length of study for undergraduate, as we mentioned, is 4 years. And as graduate studies, there was no particular length. So Ibn Wahab, he studied under Malik ibn Anas for 20 years. So and then Ibn Aqil, he studied under Qadi Abu Ya'la for 11 years. So this was, there was not really, once you're past the undergraduate, you could continue graduate studies for an extended period of time. What was valued for them was memorization. And Abu al-Mahasin al-Ruyani, he said that, he died in 502 Hijri, he said, if the works of a Shafi'i were destroyed by fire, I could dictate their contents from memory. This is what they valued. They were prodigious memorizers. This is one example of how they wanted you to learn. The professor would dictate to the student. The student would write down and read it to see if he understands it. Then he would seclude himself to memorize it, and then the professor would ask him to read his memorized portion, and then they would repeat. This was the methodology of teaching. They like to repeat things over and over again. Shirazi said, if you do not repeat a thing 50 times, it will not become firmly embedded in your mind. So they were big fans of repetition. But at the same time, they understood the purpose that memorization and comprehension have to go side by side. Zamakhshari said, learning is a city, one of whose gates is understanding and the other is retrieval from memory. So you can't just have one without the other. But at the same time, they wanted you to memorize. So Abu Latif al-Baghdadi said, when you read a book, make every effort to learn it by heart, master its meaning. Imagine that the book has disappeared, and then you can dispense with it, and you won't even be affected by its loss. This is how they wanted you to learn. That was also one of the famous incidents with Imam al-Ghazali, as you probably have heard that story before, where the robbers were stealing his books, and he said, don't take my knowledge. He said, what kind of knowledge do you have if I can just steal it, these books? And so then after that he started to memorize and dispense with these kind of books. But that was a famous example from Imam al-Ghazali's lifetime. But at the same time, they did criticize some people for not writing things down, particularly in this field of hadith. Al-Bukhari famously criticized Ikrama al-Yamani because he said his hadiths are weak because he has not committed them to writing. So gradually in the field of hadith, when you have hundreds of thousands of hadith, you have to at some point commit yourself to writing them down. Otherwise they will lose track in your memory. So they used to have, as part of their learning, mudhakara. And mudhakara would be like you test your memory. You have competitions with each other about memory. Ishaq ibn Rahawi, he said that I knew by heart 70,000 hadith. And I could do mudhakara, meaning this competition, of 100,000 hadith. So he said this is what people would compete each other. This was part of the educational process. And then part of the educational process was khilaf and jadal, disputation and debate. And this is a very important part of the graduation from college. The last part of graduation was that you had to defend your thesis against your professor, meaning they would give masail, questions, and then they would teach them the methodology of dealing with them, including all possible objections. So, for example, Abu Muzaffar al-Sam'ani, he died 489 Hijri, author of Burhan fil Khilaf. He said that this book contained close to 1,000 disputed questions. So it had questions over to the dispute, and then you would have to answer them. So this is what Ibn Aqil wrote in his book Wadih fil Usul al-Fiqh. He described the method. He said, in writing this book, I followed a method. I presented in logical order the thesis, then the arguments, then the replies to the objections, then the pseudo-arguments of the opponents to these counter-theses, then the replies in rebuttal of these pseudo-arguments, for the purposes of teaching beginners the method of disputation, tariqatun nadhar. So this is, you see what they were teaching. They were teaching you, in many times in debate, you have people make what's called a straw man. You make a weak position of your enemy. You take your enemy's position, you make it into some kind of weird character. It's not really what he was trying to say. But the real way of debating is you make your enemy's position an Iron Man, meaning you make it as strong as they would make it. And then you defeat it based on the strongest way that they would present it. And that's what Ibn Aqil is talking about in his position. That they would make it as strong as possible, yet they would reply to they would make their own objections, and then they would reply to their objections. So this is, if you look in his book, you will find, and he's just talking about one book, but this is how all of the students would learn, the higher level students. Lower level students, you memorize. Higher level students, you start to work on khilaf and jadal. And that was the way you would graduate from the college. That was the final. And then they would have competitions, riyasa, to see who was best in this jadal and munadhara. For example, Al-Jurjani, a famous Hanafi scholar, he would debate Abu Bakr al-Razi, who was also a Hanafi scholar. So they were both debating each other, and they would draw large crowds. In Baghdad, they would have large crowds watching these people debate each other, to the point sometimes it would lead to violence. So for example, famously, Imam Shafi'i, there was a man, Fityan al-Maliki, who would engage, and he was beaten by Imam Shafi'i so thoroughly that Fityan started cursing him. He became angry, he started cursing him. And then the people became mad at him, Fityan, so they beat him in the marketplace. And then the supporters of Fityan then became mad and they beat Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah. And this beating that he received ultimately is how he died. He had succumbed from the injury. So it was very heated debates sometimes. And these were very commonly held. So I don't know how much time. When do we have to leave here? 8 minutes. Oh, okay. Well, I will then fast forward to pages. I've put too many pages together, let's just be honest. So the academic positions, I'm just going to tell you some of the academic positions that we had. Mudarris was the professor, Qadi, Khatib, Imam, Rayis, Naib was the deputy for the professor. If the professor left for a time, he would appoint a deputy. In fact, there was candidate professors, mulazim. The Ottomans called this person who was a candidate to become a professor, mulazim. There was a person who was a graduate assistant. His position was mu'id. He would just repeat what the professor would say as a form of teaching the undergraduates. And then there was a person who was basically assistant professor. His title was mufid. Mufid is like docent, which in English they talk about as an assistant professor. And the student of law was mutafaqqih, and the graduate was faqih. And so they had these titles. And then they had a person who kept attendance, katib al-ghaiba. He would write if anybody didn't attend. And in the college they would have mubtadi'un, the first level, then they had mutawassitun, and then they had muntahun, the end level. All these were there. So what was the difference between this and the West? And so the basic difference was, as you can see, when we talked about all these things, the reason I went into detail is when you look at all these Islamic practices, you can start to see in your Western institutions, all of these things are there. Whether it's defensive thesis, whether it's the lecture process, whether it's, all of these levels. So you can understand that when people say, and try to claim there's no influence from Islamic sciences on the Western learning institutions, that it's definitely a falsehood. They were right next to each other geographically, physically, they were learning from each other. And many of these things had no basis in Western education before that. And that's what Al-Maqdisi says, is that, George Maqdisi, he says that these institutions, these kinds of intellectual discussions, debate, and jadal, did not happen before Islam sort of established this practice. And so this is the basis of what they took. But as far as the university system, he said there was a big difference, that the West had an innovation in the term of university. He said the Muslims didn't have university, we had colleges. But the difference is the university was founded like a corporation. And this is actually a Western innovation, which is the corporation itself. And what do they say about the corporation now? It's like a person, right? That's what the Republicans here, they basically said the corporations are people. They have a right to say whatever they want. They have a right to spend money however they want. So they said they can't be limited by political contributions. Well, the same way the university is a corporation. So it became like its own entity, like an individual with its own interests. It had trustees, but it could change over time. So it allowed itself to stay more stable. And it allowed itself to be in a different category compared to the waqf we see. The waqf in Islamic tradition was individual. And so a person, it would last for a while and then it would sort of fade away, but it also had certain rules. You couldn't change them. They were the rules that were there. And so that's why, at least according to Dr. Maqdisi, why he thinks that there was a difference in terms of how they persisted. Because after all, the Western institution, universities definitely lasted longer than some of the colleges that the Muslims established. And so that was one thing. And then, let's see. Yeah, again, that was the basic difference. Now, he did talk about two universities in Europe that may have been influenced by Muslim colleges, Palencia in Spain and Naples in Italy. They were in near North Africa, where we said Maliki law was predominant, and in those areas they established colleges based on the government. And so he thinks that those two universities in particular were established based on a model of Muslim colleges. The other difference between Western education and Muslim education was ijaza is given by a person to a person, meaning that it's highly variable. One sheikh will give you ijaza easily. One sheikh, you can be with him for a long time, he won't give you ijaza, right? This is the individual difference. Whereas the degree from a college is more institutionalized. It's based on a corporation, it's based on certain standards, it's based on a guild mentality. The masters establish the standards, people meet the standards. So that was also a difference between Western and Eastern institutions. I think the other difference is that the governments in Muslim lands, they had a lot to do with the Muslim educational institutions. After all, Nizam al-Mulk is a prime minister. He's establishing the Nizamiya, right? And there is this thing which is called the Ulama State Alliance. The ulama are basically a kind of part of the state institution. It's what Imam al-Ghazali left these institutions. Why? Because he no longer wanted to be controlled by the state. This is, if you look at his history, he left the Nizamiya, he left another institution in Damascus. Why? Because he wanted to be not under the state any longer. And if you were in those institutions, you were controlled by the state. So in that, there's another difference between us and the Western universities, that by and large, they are not controlled directly by the state. Now, they do have state influence, but they are not directly controlled by the state. So I hope that was at least a little bit of introduction to this field. There's a lot more to say. But I think what we need to understand is the university itself was a Western innovation. But the college system and the educational learning institutions, the ways of learning, were definitely heavily influenced by Muslim forms of learning. And for us, when we go forward, we need to learn, what did they do better in their university system compared to us, and what are they doing better in their teaching methods now that we can incorporate in our own teaching. I would have to disagree with some of the scholars who say, for example, you have to learn from a sheikh personally by yourself, and you can't do online learning. There's many shuyukh would say that. Maybe that was back in the day, when you didn't have any information, but there are advancements, and now you have access to many forms of learning. And so I think just this example should be an example to all of us, because how they were able to advance knowledge past what our limits, was some of these innovations that they made. And so we should definitely take, like they took from us, the best of what we did, and inshallah to expand knowledge and learning in the future. I think we're going to have to end, but anybody, any questions, comments? Well done. Sitting up. From to sit up. Yeah, attentive position. Yeah. That's what I was, yeah. Yes. Right. The brother was asking if... Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Brother is making a comment that both a question and a comment, I think probably an opinion, that maybe that we need the madrasa system, the madaris, to be combined with modern institutions like universities. Now in Muslim lands, we do have universities and madaris as well. And unfortunately, there are parallel institutions. Maybe they need to have some overlap, and maybe some of the madrasas need to become universities. I think that's something that needs to be studied for sure. I think it's probably one of the limitations of their graduates, that they are not as well educated in Western sciences. And that was by design, of course, but maybe the design needs to be updated, because after all, the same Nizam al-Mulk who established the Nizamiyya, in 490 something Hijri, is the same Nizamiyya curriculum that we have today. So almost exactly. So I think you can see that we probably have need for update and need for advancement in these areas. So yes. And the universities, they need to probably fuse in some way together. And I think that's, if you look at Dar al-Qasim, the head of the institution, I think that's one of his points, is that Islamic learning, when it became divorced from scientific learning, it divorced the ethos of Islam from science. And Islam has a lot to say about science, about bioethics, about how you should learn or what you should learn. And if you don't teach them in an Islamic way, it leads a huge gap, and it develops this dichotomy between scientists and Islamic thinkers. And so, for example, one of the leading AI people is a Muslim who says he became an atheist. SubhanAllah. If you look at one of the leading AI people. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. So I think we do need Islamic infusion in our university system to understand the spirit of Islam and learning. All right, we're going to end there. Security will kick us